Panpsychism is a new form of creationism. I'm sure this will strike some of you as controversial, but philosophers often fail to take seriously the implications of the Darwinian revolution. And so that's the topic of this video. In a recent post, I criticized panpsychism for following the same mantra as creationists. Just creationists could not believe in Darwinian evolution because it challenged their cherished belief in the divine and in our uniqueness within creation. Panpsychists are hesitant to explain consciousness in terms of physical processes, out of a fear that this would rob consciousness of its magical properties. Now, the fact that science makes only gradual progress and that there's always more to learn about complex phenomena is taken by both creationists and panpsychists as a reason to reject the possibility of a scientific explanation of their respective phenomena outright. And unsurprisingly, panpsychists resisted my charge that their view constitutes a potential case of pseudo-philosophy, just as creationism is a pseudoscience. However, in a recent post, the panpsychist Caddick, who I've previously engaged with, tellingly reveals an anti-Darwinian attitude shared by many philosophers who have refused to take Darwin seriously because of his radical implications for philosophy. It is here that we can see the close relationship between panpsychism and the pseudoscience of creationism once more. So let's dissect his argument in detail. First, Caddick argues that the vagueness argument against physicalism starts from a very straightforward intuition. I quote here, "Consciousness seems to be like a light switch. The light bulb is either determinately on or off. Analogously, either there's something that is like to be me or there's nothing. Even if my experience is faint, blurry, sleepy or transient, there's still a determinate fact regarding whether it is present in the first place." So the concept of consciousness seems to be a sharp concept, meaning that it admits of no borderline cases. What is my response? Now, that consciousness admits of no borderline cases may seem intuitive, but here panpsychists reveal the problematic tendency among analytic philosophers to fetishize their own intuitions. Cognitive scientists have well established that the way we think about the world involves carving it into useful categories, whether or not these track reality. It's hard to imagine that the eyes gradually came into existence, that a human body could grow from an egg and a sperm, or that the boundary between lions and tigers is blurry. Creationists smugly responded that Darwinism defies logic, but what Darwinism really showed is that our intuitions about the natural world are a terrible guide to understanding its fundamental nature. Now, Caddick acknowledges that, quoting here, "The contents of our experience do admit of borderline cases. I can experience a slow, gradual color shift from purple to blue without there being a fact of when the color becomes determinately blue. Physical concepts seem similarly vague. For example, neurons can gradually lose function through damage and neural systems can gradually become more complex via evolution. There's no determinate fact, no sharp cutoff point that determines state as definitely a neuron and that very same state -1 quark as definitely not a neuron. Mapping the contents of our experience to neurons should not be an issue then, since they both involve vague and indeterminate concepts, which admit of such borderline cases." And he continues, "The problem appears when we try to map consciousness as such, namely the sharp condition of whether consciousness is present or absent, to vague physical concepts. Proponents of the vagueness argument against physicalism thus conclude that consciousness as such cannot be physical, since no physical concept is sharp. All physical concepts are vague, so the sharpness of consciousness cannot be explained in physical terms. If these concepts correctly refer, that is, if they carve nature at its joints and actually describe reality, then the further conclusion is that consciousness as such cannot be instantiated by an essentially vague physical base. There's nothing in nature, nothing physical, that could account for the sharp character of consciousness." How do I respond? Well, if all physical concepts have blurry boundaries, though I should note that this blurriness itself can come in degrees, things can be more or less graded, right? Then why leap to the conclusion that physicalism must be false? This is an astonishing leap of logic. Even as a philosopher well versed in evolutionary biology, having written an introduction to the philosophy of science of evolutionary models, I'm still amazed myself that such complex traits as eyes, brains, flight, multicellular life and life itself gradually emerged. Our minds are not built to think about timescales of millions of years. To become a physicist, you need to abandon the idea that physics must conform to your intuitions or common sense. Empirical results in science have no obligation at all to adhere to them, which is how enlightenment got off the ground. No longer was there authority given to intuition alone. Unfortunately, human psychology is not well suited to accepting that science undermines our intuitions. After all, our intuitions just feel right. But that is a terrible way of doing philosophy. Now, Kadek continues, noting that if one is convinced by the vagueness argument, then physicalism is untenable, and we have to look elsewhere for a complete explanation of consciousness. Michael Tye, who spent most of his career defending representationalist physicalism, became a panpsychist because of the implications of the vagueness argument. He argued that if consciousness is sharp, but evolution is a smooth and gradual process, then consciousness cannot be a biological property that simply turns on once a certain threshold of complexity is reached. Otherwise, this would be a case of strong emergence, where an entirely new property comes about from something that did not have that property before in any capacity, where dead matter suddenly illuminates with interiority like turning on a light switch without any gradual precursor. So if we reject strong emergence, he continues, and accept that consciousness is sharp, the only theory that can accommodate its sharpness and the gradual nature of evolution is panpsychism. As Tye argues, if consciousness as such is fundamental, as the spark that simply indicates whether or not experience is present, then complex consciousness like ours does not come out of nothing. Rather, evolution leads to a gradual increase of complexity that corresponds to more and more complex forms of consciousness. Panpsychism is therefore the only view that allows for sharp consciousness, while allowing biological organisms to evolve gradually. So what is my response here? Well, panpsychism may well be the only view that accommodates the intuition that consciousness must be like a light switch, but that is not much of a reason in its favor. Indeed, it reflects the very same resistance found among creationists who could not conceive that something as complex and special as the human body, or animals more generally, could have gradually emerged. Inference to the best explanation would suggest that consciousness is just like all other biological traits, and that our intuition is simply unreliable here, as it is in many other sciences, including physics, chemistry, biology, and the social sciences. You might think of the Simpsons meme with Skinner, who might think, oh, could consciousness have gradually evolved like all other complex biological traits? And responding, no, it must have existed from the beginning. That's clearly a bad argument. So, until then, the argument seems similarly embarrassing, I think, to creationists who've claimed that there cannot be a design without a designer, because that is our intuitive understanding of the term, while panpsychists do not typically endorse creationism. Some, such as the philosopher Philip Goff, comes close to with pseudoscientific talk of an inherent purpose guiding the direction of the universe. And even when they do not, the assertion that consciousness must have existed from the very beginning is reminiscent of the idea that there must have been a divine being at the beginning of it all. I don't think these arguments are very convincing. And I hope you like this video. Share it if you like. And I might see you in another episode.